We turn now to the growing level of economic uncertainty surrounding the North American auto industry. The big three are navigating a new era as they deal with the impact of President Trump's tariffs.
The problems just seem to keep piling up for Chevrolet and GMC this year. If you own a Chevy or are thinking about buying one, then you might want to think again, at least for right now.
We are going to begin here tonight with the sweeping changes coming to America's biggest automaker. General Motors said today it is cutting close to 14,000 jobs, including 15% of its salaried workforce.
Chevrolet has abruptly pulled the plug on its U.S. production, and the shock is reverberating across America. Plants in Michigan, Texas, and Missouri, once roaring with the sound of assembly lines, now stand silent. This was no gradual slowdown. It was a sudden halt that struck directly at the heart of General Motors' most profitable vehicles, the Silverado, the Tahoe, and the Blazer. Billions of dollars in output evaporated overnight, leaving workers and suppliers stunned. For tens of thousands of employees, the reality was brutal. Shifts were canceled, paychecks disappeared, and entire households were thrown into crisis. The ripples spread quickly. Contractors, suppliers, and transport workers suddenly found themselves with nothing to move, nothing to deliver, and no way to cover their bills. Communities built around these factories, Flint in Michigan, Toledo in Ohio, are now watching shops close, families default on mortgages, and a deep unease settle in. The question looming over these towns is simple. What happens when their largest employer walks away without warning? And the bigger concern is whether Chevrolet's shutdown is just a temporary tremor, or the first crack in the foundation of American manufacturing itself, that the devastation inside the factories was overwhelming. The initial reaction on Wall Street painted a very different picture. Investors at first cheered the announcement, praising GM for protecting shareholder value even as thousands of families were losing their livelihoods. In the hours that followed, GM's stock price swung wildly. It surged when analysts framed the cuts as a bold financial strategy, but the optimism didn't last. When the reality of collapsing profits set in, shares tumbled nearly 7%, wiping out billions in market value and exposing the fragility behind the celebrations done on the ground. Workers saw none of the silver linings. For them, this wasn't about stock charts, it was about survival. The closure was branded a betrayal of the very promise of Made in America, and anger spread quickly through GM's unionized workforce. The United Auto Workers responded with rolling protests and threats of a nationwide strike. Across factory towns, picket signs lined the streets, echoing decades of industrial unrest that many had thought belonged to history. And it wasn't just employees pushing back. Consumers began returning vehicles, canceling orders, and fueling a growing boycott movement. For GM, the trust deficit was widening, not only with its workforce, but also with the very customers it relied on. Yet behind the anger on factory floors and the turmoil in financial markets lies the spark that ignited it all: Washington's tariff war. What began as a promise to protect American industry quickly turned into the very force that pushed it to the edge. The Trump administration's decision to impose a 25% tariff on imported cars and auto parts didn't just rattle foreign competitors, it hit the U.S. auto sector itself with crushing force. Analysts estimate the global industry has already absorbed nearly $12 billion in losses, and the ripple is still spreading. For GM, the impact was immediate. The company reported a $1.1 billion hit in the second quarter alone, with forecasts warning of as much as $5 billion in annual losses if the tariffs persist. Ford, facing the same storm, issued its own warning: billions of dollars in industry-wide profits could vanish overnight. And for American consumers, the costs are no longer abstract. The average price of a new vehicle is projected to climb by $300, while large pickups, the backbone of U.S. sales, could soar by as much as $1,000. What was supposed to be protection now looks like a hidden tax reshaping both the industry's balance sheets and the budget of ordinary households. For the workers watching their paychecks vanish, and for the families struggling to hold on, the rhetoric of economic nationalism has collided with a far harsher reality. Whether this crisis marks a temporary disruption or the beginning of something far deeper, one truth is already clear. The cost of America's tariff war is being measured not just in corporate balance sheets, but in the lives of those who built the cars that once defined the nation's prosperity. The real damage of tariffs isn't in headline numbers, it's in the hidden arteries of the supply chain. Even vehicles proudly stamped Made in America aren't immune, because their lifeblood flows through parts that cross borders repeatedly before reaching the final assembly line. Take the Chevrolet Silverado. On paper, it's an American-made truck. In practice, its engine components, electronics, and steel frames flow in from Mexico, Canada, Germany, and Japan. From Mexico alone, nearly $30 billion worth of auto parts move into GM's plants each year. Now, every crossing comes with a price tag, turning once seamless trade routes into bureaucratic choke points. What used to be a finely tuned system of just-in-time deliveries have become a maze of paperwork, fees, and uncertainty. Each component is taxed not once but multiple times as it shuttles across borders, inflating costs and slowing production. For companies that once relied on efficiency as their sharpest weapon, the tariffs feel like fighting with one hand tied behind their back. GM CEO Mary Barra has quietly acknowledged the company is running contingency scenarios to blunt the impact. Yet in public, GM strikes a very different tone, offering scripted thanks to Washington for supporting American manufacturing, even as the policies themselves leave the company scrambling for survival. Behind the curtain, the reality is harsher: mounting losses, strangled supply chains, and a future being redrawn on the fly. Survival meant making choices that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. GM began by slashing nearly a third of its overseas inventory, a desperate move to dodge immediate tariff exposure. What had once been a global footprint designed for efficiency suddenly became a liability. To keep balance sheets from collapsing, the company was forced to cut deep. Then came the controversial pivot, shifting production of flagship models like the Silverado and Blazer to Mexico and South Korea, where labor costs are up to 70% lower than in the United States. For American workers, the decision looked like betrayal. For GM executives, it was the arithmetic of survival in a system that punished every domestic move with another tariff bill. Still, even as GM pulled back, it dangled the promise of return. Executives announced a $4 billion investment to bring the Blazer and Equinox back to U.S. assembly lines by 2027, estimating about 3,000 additional vehicles per year once the projects are online. In the meantime, GM has quietly ramped up output at its Fort Wayne plant in Indiana, hoping to reassure both policymakers and consumers that it intends to keep one foot firmly planted in American soil. But beneath the promises lies a harder truth. GM's strategy is no longer about loyalty to place, but about survival in a battlefield where every border crossing has become a financial ambush. And as American factories went dark, Mexico emerged as a new front line of GM's future. Plants like the one in Silao, long a cornerstone of GM's North American strategy, suddenly found themselves carrying production once synonymous with Made in America. But the bargain came at a cost. Workers in Silao earn as little as $5.50 an hour, wages that are a fraction of their U.S. counterparts. For GM, that gap is the lifeline keeping margins alive under tariff pressure. For workers, it's a bitter symbol of exploitation that has fueled resentment for years. When Mexican labor organizers press for higher wages, GM flatly refused, citing tariffs as the excuse. Executives claimed that raising pay would undermine profitability, a defense that only deepened the sense of betrayal among employees already stretched to survive on the bare minimum. The stakes stretch far beyond factory walls. If GM shutters or scales back Mexican operations under political pressure from Washington, it risks unleashing a wave of unemployment that could intensify migration northward. What began as a corporate adjustment now threatens to spill over into regional instability, drawing governments into the conflict. And so GM finds itself trapped in a tightening vice. On one side, American unions accuse it of abandoning domestic workers. On the other, Mexican labor groups threaten strikes unless wages rise. The company that once defined industrial power and American prosperity is now cornered by unrest on both sides of the border. Tariffs promise protection. Instead, they have rewritten the rules of survival, forcing GM into choices that alienate its workers, divide its consumers, and strain its global footprint. The very supply chains that once made American automakers formidable now reveal their fragility under political pressure. And the costs, economic, social, and human, are only beginning to unfold. The crisis was never going to stay contained within U.S. borders. What began as a tariff dispute inside America quickly escalated into a global flashpoint, pulling governments and rival automakers into the storm. From Washington, the threats grew sharper. President Trump floated the idea of a 100% tariff on Chevrolet vehicles produced abroad, a move designed to force GM back onto U.S. soil, but one that risked igniting a trade war with America's closest partners. Ottawa and Mexico City wasted no time signaling their readiness to retaliate. Canadian officials hinted at new protectionist measures targeting U.S. auto exports, while Mexico prepared countermeasures to defend the very plants GM had just shifted south. What was once an integrated North American supply chain began splintering under political fire. The shock waves reached even further. In Beijing, Chinese authorities imposed fresh tariffs on U.S.-made SUVs and pickups, choking off Cadillac exports just as the brand was trying to secure a foothold in one of the world's largest markets. For GM, it was another door slammed shut. Meanwhile, European and Asian competitors seized the moment. With American manufacturers paralyzed by tariffs and uncertainty, rivals from Germany, South Korea, and Japan move in to capture market share, presenting themselves as stable and reliable suppliers. What started as a dispute over auto parts had become a global contest for dominance, one where GM looked less like an aggressor and more like collateral damage. That Chevrolet's collapse is more than a corporate setback. It is a warning flare for the future of American manufacturing. This isn't simply about one company's missteps. It's about the unraveling of a promise that once defined the U.S. economy. The true losers are not Wall Street investors who can hedge bets and shift portfolios, but workers and communities left stranded. Families who trusted Made in America as a guarantee of stability are now watching that trust fracture in real time. Protectionism was sold as a shield.